Hey there, friend. Welcome back to another journey through the quieter corners of history. I'm so glad you've joined me tonight, whether you're settling down for sleep or just looking for something to slow the pace of your evening. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing we're all drifting through these old stories together, scattered across time zones, but united in curiosity. If this kind of gentle historical storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. We have many more tales from the past, waiting to lull us into restful nights. Now, settle in. Pull those blankets a little closer, dim the lights, and let your breathing slow. Tonight, we're not travelling to grand battles or royal courts. Instead, we're slipping back to a time when the calendar itself was a source of wonder and terror. When holidays weren't just days off work, but elaborate rituals that could mean the difference between prosperity and starvation, between divine favour and cosmic wrath. Picture this. You think your modern holiday stress is overwhelming? Try celebrating Christmas when a single misstep in the ceremony could anger God himself. Imagine preparing for Easter when the very date depends on complex calculations that most people can't understand, when missing church could result in public penance, and when your feast might be the only decent meal you'll have for months. Medieval holidays weren't the cheerful, commercialized affairs we know today. They were intense, exhausting, sometimes frightening events that consumed entire communities for weeks at a time. They were moments when the thin veil between the earthly and divine worlds grew thinner still, when saints walked among mortals, when demons lurked at crossroads, and when a poorly timed sneeze during Mass could mark you as possessed. So tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, let's explore what it was really like to celebrate in an age when every holiday was a matter of life, death, and eternal salvation. Let's discover why medieval people both yearned for and dreaded these sacred interruptions to their harsh daily lives. The medieval calendar was not your friend. While we complain about daylight saving time, medieval people lived in a world where time itself was a mystery wrapped in religious doctrine and sprinkled with astronomical confusion. The year didn't even start on January 1st, not consistently anyway. Depending on where you lived, the new year might begin on Christmas, Easter, the Feast of the Annunciation in March, or any number of other religious observances. But here's what made medieval holidays truly exhausting. They weren't optional. Modern people can choose to skip Valentine's Day or sleep through New Year's Eve. Medieval people had no such luxury. Missing a major religious holiday wasn't just antisocial, it was literally heretical. Church attendance wasn't suggested, it was mandatory, and we're not talking about showing up for an hour on Sunday morning. Major holidays could stretch for days or even weeks, with multiple services, processions, fasts, feasts, and elaborate rituals that demanded your complete participation. Take Christmas, for instance. The celebration didn't begin on December 25th and end the next morning. It started with Advent, 4 weeks of preparation that included fasting, special prayers, and increasingly intense anticipation. The actual Christmas season lasted 12 days, each with its own customs, foods, and religious observances. Miss one element, show insufficient enthusiasm, or heaven forbid, work when you should be celebrating, and you'd face everything from social ostracism to formal punishment by church authorities. The pressure was immense. These weren't casual gatherings with family and friends. They were community-wide performances of faith, elaborate productions where everyone had a role to play and everyone was watching everyone else for signs of insufficient piety, or worse, secret heresy. Imagine trying to enjoy Christmas dinner while knowing that your neighbours are scrutinising how devoutly you pray, how generously you give to the poor, and whether your celebration demonstrates the proper balance between joy and reverence. And the preparations, the preparations were backbreaking. Months before major holidays, entire villages would begin the complex process of getting ready. Animals had to be fattened for slaughter, but only certain animals at certain times. Special foods had to be prepared according to recipes that were as much religious ritual as cooking instruction. Houses had to be cleaned, not just for tidiness, but for spiritual purification. Clothes had to be mended or new ones made, because appearing shabby before God was unthinkable. The church calendar dominated everything. Ordinary people, most of whom couldn't read, had to memorize dozens of saints' days, fast days, feast days, and holy observances. Get the schedule wrong and you might find yourself eating meat on a fast day, a sin that required confession and penance. The complexity was staggering, with different rules for different social classes, different regions, and different monastic orders all layered on top of each other. But perhaps most challenging of all was the way medieval holidays mixed genuine joy with genuine terror. These celebrations weren't just about happiness and community. They were about salvation and damnation, about appeasing an often angry God, about warding off demons who were thought to be particularly active during holy times. Every laugh had to be measured, every song had to be appropriate. Every moment of pleasure had to be balanced against the fear that too much earthly joy might anger the divine. Christmas morning didn't begin with presents under a tree. It began in the cold darkness before dawn, with bells calling the faithful to the first of many church services. The church itself would be packed with people who had fasted for hours, their breath visible in the frigid air, their stomachs empty and growling. The service wasn't a brief, comforting ritual. It was an elaborate, hours-long ceremony conducted entirely in Latin, which most people didn't understand. Picture this scene. Hundreds of people crammed into a stone building, lit only by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The priest, draped in ornate vestments that cost more than most villagers would see in a lifetime, chants in an ancient language while performing mysterious rituals with bread and wine. Incense burns, filling the air with smoke that makes people cough and their eyes water. Children cry, adults sway from hunger and fatigue, and everyone knows that any sign of disrespect or inattention could be interpreted as spiritual failing. This wasn't passive observation. Medieval church services demanded active participation from the congregation, but participation that followed strict, unforgiving rules. You had to stand at the right times, kneel at the right times, make the sign of the cross in the proper manner, and respond to prayers you might not fully understand. Miss a cue, respond incorrectly, or show insufficient reverence, and you'd face disapproving stares from your neighbours and possible confrontation from church authorities. After the morning service, if you were fortunate enough to have food for a Christmas feast, the meal itself was governed by elaborate customs and religious restrictions. Certain foods were required, others forbidden. The order in which dishes were served, the prayers that accompanied each course, even the way you held your eating utensils carried spiritual significance. This wasn't a casual family dinner. It was a religious ceremony disguised as a meal. And the gift-giving. Nothing like our modern exchange of presents. Medieval Christmas gifts were primarily offerings to the church, donations to the poor, or tributes to feudal lords. Personal gift-giving existed, but was heavily regulated by social class and religious appropriateness. Give too little and you'd be seen as selfish. Give too much and you might be suspected of pride or even witchcraft. Everything had to be just right, perfectly balanced, appropriately humble, yet sufficiently generous. The entertainment during medieval holidays was equally fraught. Music, dancing, and games were permitted, even encouraged, but only certain types at certain times in certain ways. Secular songs might be acceptable during the day, but forbidden after sunset. Dancing was allowed but had to be dignified, controlled, never too enthusiastic or too sensual. Card games and dice were popular, but also associated with gambling and moral corruption. Many communities organized elaborate pageants and mystery plays during major holidays. performances that told biblical stories or depicted the lives of saints. These weren't simple theatrical entertainments. They were religious education for a largely illiterate population, but they were also tests of faith and community cohesion. Everyone was expected to participate, either as performers or as appropriately responsive audience members. The plays themselves could last for hours or even days, with complex staging that required the entire community to work together. But here's what made medieval holiday entertainment particularly stressful. It often included deliberate elements of fear and intimidation. Christmas pageants might feature terrifying depictions of hell and damnation, alongside scenes of nativity joy. Easter celebrations included graphic reenactments of crucifixion that were designed to provoke genuine grief and terror in the audience. These weren't feel-good holiday specials. They were intense spiritual experiences designed to shake people to their core. The line between celebration and penance was razor thin. Medieval people understood that earthly pleasure was temporary and potentially dangerous, that too much joy in this world might jeopardize their chances of joy in the next. So even their happiest holidays carried an undertone of guilt, a constant reminder that they were fallen creatures in need of redemption, that their celebrations should point toward heaven rather than indulge earthly desires. Sleep was scarce during major holidays. Between the extended church services, the elaborate meal preparations, the community obligations, and the heightened spiritual tension, people often went days with only brief periods of rest. Exhaustion was common, which only added to the intense, almost hallucinogenic quality of medieval holiday experiences. People reported visions, divine encounters, and spiritual revelations during these times, experiences that were simultaneously sought after and feared. The weather made everything worse. Most major Christian holidays fell during the darkest, coldest months of the year. Churches were unheated stone buildings where people's breath froze and fingers went numb while trying to hold prayer books. Houses were barely warmer, with primitive heating that filled rooms with smoke while providing minimal warmth. People bundled in their heaviest clothes, which made the elaborate bowing, kneeling, and processing required during services even more awkward and uncomfortable. And through it all, the constant awareness that you were being judged, not just by your neighbors, not just by church authorities, but by God Himself. Medieval people believed that their behavior during holy days was particularly scrutinized by divine powers, that their eternal fate might be determined by how well they observed these sacred times. Every action carried enormous weight. Every mistake had cosmic consequences. This is where we'll pause for tonight, dear listener. Let your breathing deepen. Let your muscles relax. We've only begun to explore the complex, exhausting, sometimes terrifying world of medieval holidays. But for now, rest easy, knowing that your modern holiday stress, whatever it might be, pales in comparison to the spiritual and social pressures faced by our ancestors. Close your eyes and drift towards sleep, grateful for electric lights and central heating, for the freedom to celebrate or not as you choose, for holidays that bring joy without the constant fear of divine retribution. Tomorrow we'll continue our journey into this fascinating world where every celebration was a matter of eternal significance. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this gentle exploration of history's quieter moments. The feast itself, when it finally arrived, was a production that would exhaust any modern event planner. Medieval holiday meals weren't just about food. They were elaborate theatrical performances where every dish carried symbolic weight and every bite was fraught with religious significance. The Christmas feast, for instance, wasn't simply a matter of cooking a large meal. It was a carefully choreographed ritual that began days before anyone sat down to eat. First, there was the matter of acquiring the food, which in medieval times was neither simple nor guaranteed. Unlike our modern grocery stores, with their endless aisles of choices, medieval people had to plan their holiday meals around what was available, what was permitted, and what they could actually afford. The church had strict rules about which foods were appropriate for which holidays. And breaking these dietary laws wasn't just bad manners, it was potentially heretical. The preparation of holiday food was a community affair, but not in the warm, cozy way we might imagine. Entire villages would work together out of necessity rather than choice, because individual households rarely had the resources or facilities to prepare elaborate holiday feasts on their own. The lord of the manor might provide the main course, usually a massive roasted animal, but everyone else had to contribute something. Miss your assigned contribution, and you'd face social ostracism and possibly legal consequences. The cooking itself took place over open fires in smoky, poorly ventilated kitchens, where temperatures could reach unbearable levels. Women, for it was almost always women who did this work, would spend days before major holidays standing over blazing hearths, stirring massive pots, turning roasting spits, and trying not to burn themselves or the food. There were no thermometers, no timers, no reliable ways to gauge when something was properly cooked. Everything depended on experience, instinct, and prayer. But here's what made medieval holiday cooking truly nightmarish. The consequences of failure were severe. Ruin the Christmas roast, and you weren't just disappointed. You were potentially responsible for ruining the entire community's celebration. Overcook the Easter bread, and you might be accused of showing insufficient respect for the resurrection of Christ. The pressure was enormous, and there was no backup plan, no emergency takeout, no way to fix a disaster except to accept the shame and face whatever punishment the community deemed appropriate. The seating arrangements at medieval holiday feasts were elaborate displays of social hierarchy that could take hours to sort out properly. Everyone had a specific place based on their social status, their relationship to the host, their age, their gender, and their standing in the community. Sit in the wrong spot, and you'd commit a social offence that could have lasting consequences. The most honoured guests sat closest to the head table, while servants and lower-class attendees were relegated to the far ends of the hall, sometimes so distant they could barely see the main courses. The actual eating was governed by complex rules of etiquette that turned every meal into a test of social competency. Medieval people didn't have individual plates in the way we understand them. Instead, they shared trenchers, thick slices of bread that served as communal plates. Multiple people would eat from the same trencher, which meant you had to be extremely careful about how much you took, in what order you took it, and how you behaved while eating. Table manners were not suggestions, they were moral imperatives. Reach for food at the wrong time, and you'd be seen as gluttonous. Take too large a portion, and you'd be branded as selfish. Chew too loudly, wipe your hands on the wrong part of your clothing, or fail to properly bless your food, and you'd mark yourself as uncivilized or, worse, ungodly. Medieval etiquette books, written primarily for the nobility but influencing behaviour throughout society, contained hundreds of rules about proper eating behaviour. The conversation during these feasts was equally regulated. You couldn't just chat about whatever came to mind. Holiday meals required specific types of discussion, usually focused on religious themes appropriate to the occasion. Telling inappropriate jokes, gossiping about neighbours, or discussing worldly concerns during a sacred feast could be seen as profane. Instead, diners were expected to engage in edifying conversation about scripture, the lives of saints, or moral instruction. But perhaps most challenging of all was the sheer length of these holiday meals. We're not talking about a 2-hour dinner party. Medieval holiday feasts could last 6, 8, even 12 hours, with multiple courses served at elaborate intervals. Between courses, there might be entertainment, prayers, speeches, or ceremonial presentations. Guests were expected to remain engaged and appropriately enthusiastic throughout the entire ordeal, no matter how tired, uncomfortable, or overfed they became. The entertainment between courses was itself a source of stress. Medieval holiday feasts featured troubadours, jesters, musicians, and storytellers. But their performances weren't just for fun. They were educational tools designed to reinforce religious and moral lessons. The songs told stories of saints and martyrs. The jokes, such as they were, carried moral instruction. Even the music was chosen for its spiritual significance rather than its entertainment value. And then there was the drinking. Medieval holiday celebrations involved enormous quantities of alcohol, partly because it was often safer than water, but mainly because it was seen as necessary for proper celebration. However, the line between appropriately festive drinking and sinful intoxication was carefully monitored. Drink too little, and you'd seem ungrateful or overly prideful. Drink too much, and you'd risk accusations of gluttony and moral weakness. Finding the right balance required constant vigilance and self-control. The clean-up after these massive holiday feasts was a community undertaking that could take days. Everything had to be cleaned, sorted, and stored properly, not just for hygiene, but for spiritual reasons. Leftover food couldn't simply be thrown away. It had to be distributed to the poor according to strict guidelines about charitable giving. Dishes had to be washed in specific ways, with prayers and blessings accompanying the work. Even the bones and scraps had to be disposed of according to religious customs. But the most exhausting aspect of medieval holiday feasts wasn't the physical demands. It was the emotional and spiritual pressure. These weren't casual social gatherings. They were performances of faith, community cohesion, and social hierarchy, all rolled into one. Every participant was simultaneously host and guest, performer and audience, judge and judged. You had to demonstrate the right level of joy without seeming frivolous, the right level of reverence without seeming pompous, the right level of generosity without seeming proud. The children at these feasts faced their own particular challenges. They were expected to behave like miniature adults, displaying perfect manners and appropriate piety throughout the entire lengthy celebration. There were no special accommodations for their shorter attention spans or different dietary needs. A child who misbehaved during a holiday feast didn't just embarrass their family, they potentially disrupted the entire community's spiritual observance. The servants working these feasts had perhaps the most difficult job of all. They had to provide flawless service while remaining essentially invisible, attending to hundreds of guests without making mistakes that could ruin the celebration. They worked in sweltering kitchens, carrying heavy platters through crowded halls, all while maintaining the humble demeanor expected of their social class. A servant who dropped a dish or served the wrong person could face severe punishment. The religious significance of every element made even simple mistakes potentially catastrophic. Spill wine during a Christmas feast, and you might be accused of showing disrespect for the blood of Christ. Drop bread during an Easter celebration, and you could be seen as defiling the body of the Saviour. These weren't just social gaffes, they were spiritual offences that could result in public penance or worse. As the feast finally wound down, often well into the night or even the following day, exhausted participants would face the daunting prospect of cleaning up while maintaining their spiritual focus. The holiday wasn't over just because the eating had stopped. There would be evening prayers, midnight services, or dawn celebrations still to come. Sleep was a luxury that few could afford during major medieval holidays. Let your eyelids grow heavy now, dear listener. Feel your body sinking deeper into your comfortable bed, grateful for the simple pleasure of eating when you're hungry, drinking what you choose, and celebrating or not celebrating as your heart desires. We've barely scratched the surface of medieval holiday complexity, but already you can sense the overwhelming nature of these sacred celebrations. Close your eyes and imagine the smoky great halls falling quiet at last, the exhausted celebrants finally finding their rest, the embers of cooking fires dying down to glowing coals. Tomorrow we'll explore more of this fascinating world, where every holiday was a community production, every celebration a test of faith, and every feast a performance that could determine your standing with both God and neighbours. Rest well, and thank you for joining me in this gentle journey through history's more demanding celebrations. But the feast was only the beginning of the medieval holiday ordeal. Once the last trencher was cleared and the final prayer of thanksgiving mumbled through wine-numbed lips, the real work of celebration began. Because in medieval times, holidays weren't single-day events that ended when you went to bed. They were elaborate, multi-day productions that could stretch for weeks, each day bringing new obligations, new rituals, and new opportunities to accidentally offend God or your neighbours. Take the 12 Days of Christmas, which weren't a charming song about partridges and pear trees, but a grueling marathon of religious observance that left entire communities exhausted. Each day had its own specific requirements. January 1st was the Feast of the Circumcision, demanding particular prayers and ceremonies. January 6th brought Epiphany, with its own elaborate rituals involving the blessing of water, chalk, and incense. Miss any of these observances, show insufficient enthusiasm, or commit some minor breach of protocol, and you'd find yourself the subject of whispered gossip and clerical disapproval. The gift-giving during these extended celebrations was nothing like our modern exchange of presents. Medieval holiday gifts were carefully calculated offerings that served multiple purposes, demonstrating your piety, displaying your social status, fulfilling your feudal obligations, and appeasing various spiritual and temporal authorities all at once. The lord of the manor expected tribute from his tenants. The church expected donations from everyone. The poor expected charity from anyone with surplus. Your neighbours expected tokens of friendship and community solidarity. But here's what made medieval gift-giving truly stressful. There were no gift guides, no suggested retail prices, no Amazon wish lists to follow. You had to navigate complex social hierarchies and religious expectations without any clear guidance about what was appropriate. Give too little to your feudal superior, and you'd be seen as ungrateful or rebellious. Give too much, and you might be suspected of trying to curry inappropriate favour, or of having wealth you hadn't properly declared to tax collectors. The gifts themselves were often practical items rather than luxuries. A tenant might give his lord a chicken or a bag of grain. A craftsman might offer his services for free during the holiday period. Women often gave handmade items like embroidered cloths or woven goods that represented hours of labour. These weren't spontaneous expressions of affection. They were carefully planned economic transactions disguised as seasonal generosity. Children during medieval holidays faced their own particular form of torture. They were expected to behave like miniature adults throughout these lengthy celebrations, displaying perfect piety and flawless manners, while surrounded by festivities they could barely understand. There were no special children's activities, no toys designed for their amusement, no accommodation for their natural energy and curiosity. Instead, children were required to sit through hours-long church services, participate in complex rituals, and memorize prayers and responses in Latin. They had to fast when adults fasted, feast when adults feasted, and maintain appropriate solemnity throughout celebrations that could last from dawn to well past midnight. A child who fidgeted during Mass, asked inappropriate questions about religious mysteries, or showed too much excitement about secular entertainments would face swift correction from parents terrified of appearing to raise ungodly offspring. The music during medieval holidays was equally demanding. Modern people might imagine charming carol singers going door to door, but medieval holiday music was serious business that required extensive preparation and perfect execution. Church choirs spent months learning complex polyphonic arrangements that had to be performed flawlessly during important services. Secular musicians had to master appropriate songs for different parts of the celebration, knowing that choosing the wrong music at the wrong time could be seen as spiritually dangerous. The dancing, when it was permitted, followed strict rules about who could dance with whom, which steps were appropriate, and how long the dancing could continue. Men and women often danced separately, and even mixed dancing was heavily regulated to prevent any suggestion of impropriety. The dances themselves were formal, ritualized affairs rather than spontaneous expressions of joy. Everyone had to know the proper steps, the correct timing, and the appropriate level of enthusiasm to display. But perhaps the most exhausting aspect of medieval holidays was the constant need to demonstrate your faith publicly and convincingly. These celebrations weren't private family affairs where you could let your guard down. They were community-wide performances where everyone was watching everyone else for signs of insufficient piety, secret heresy, or moral corruption. You couldn't just go through the motions. You had to appear genuinely moved by the religious significance of the occasion. This meant that even your facial expressions were scrutinized. Smile too much during a solemn moment, and you'd be seen as frivolous or disrespectful. Show too little joy during celebratory portions, and you might be suspected of spiritual dryness or even demonic influence. Finding the right emotional tone and maintaining it throughout days of celebration required constant vigilance and exhausting self-control. The weather, as always in medieval life, made everything infinitely worse. Most major Christian holidays fell during the darkest, coldest months of the year, when daylight was scarce and warmth was precious. Church buildings were unheated stone structures where people's breath froze and candles provided the only light. Processions and outdoor ceremonies took place in snow, rain, and bitter wind, with participants expected to maintain their dignity and devotion despite numb fingers and chattering teeth. The clothing requirements for holiday celebrations added another layer of complexity and expense. You couldn't simply wear your everyday garments to important religious observances. Holiday clothing had to be clean, appropriate to your social station, and suitable for the specific religious significance of the occasion. Poor families might spend months preparing special garments for major holidays, using precious resources that could have gone toward food or shelter. But the clothing had to be just right, too elaborate, and you'd be accused of pride or of aspiring above your proper social station. Too simple, and you'd be seen as showing disrespect for the sacred occasion. The colours, fabrics, and styles all carried meaning that everyone was expected to understand and observe. A mistake in holiday attire could mark you as ignorant, impious, or socially inappropriate. The waste produced by these elaborate celebrations was staggering, yet nothing could simply be discarded. Every scrap of food, every piece of decoration, every remnant of the celebration had to be disposed of according to religious and social customs. Bread that had been blessed couldn't be thrown away like ordinary refuse. Decorations that had adorned churches or altars required special handling. Even the ashes from holiday fires were considered spiritually significant. The cleanup after major holidays was a community undertaking that could take as long as the celebration itself. Houses had to be spiritually cleansed as well as physically cleaned. Special prayers accompanied the removal of holiday decorations. The redistribution of leftover food to the poor followed elaborate protocols designed to demonstrate proper Christian charity while maintaining social hierarchies. And through it all, the constant awareness that the holiday season would eventually end, returning everyone to the harsh realities of medieval daily life. The brief period of relative abundance would give way to the lean months of late winter and early spring. The community solidarity demonstrated during celebrations would be tested by the practical challenges of survival. The spiritual highs of religious observance would fade into the mundane struggles of everyday existence. Yet even as one holiday ended, preparations would already be beginning for the next observance on the church calendar. Medieval life was a continuous cycle of religious celebrations, each with its own demands, its own opportunities for spiritual and social failure, its own exhausting requirements for community participation and personal devotion. The psychological toll of this constant performance of faith was enormous. Medieval people lived under continuous spiritual and social surveillance, where every action during sacred times was interpreted as evidence of their moral and religious character. The pressure to maintain appropriate holiday behavior for weeks at a time, surrounded by equally stressed neighbours and overseen by vigilant church authorities, created a level of anxiety that we can barely imagine today. Sleep was precious and scarce during these extended celebrations. Between the lengthy religious services, the elaborate meal preparations, the social obligations, and the heightened spiritual tension, people often went days, with only brief periods of rest. This chronic exhaustion only added to the intense, almost hallucinogenic quality of medieval holiday experiences, where the line between religious ecstasy and simple fatigue became increasingly blurred. Let your breathing slow now, dear listener. Feel your shoulders relaxing, your jaw unclenching, your mind releasing the complexity of these ancient celebrations. We've journeyed deep into the demanding world of medieval holidays, where every moment of joy came with spiritual responsibility, where every feast was a test of faith, and where community celebration meant community surveillance. Rest easy tonight, grateful for holidays that end when you want them to, celebrations that don't require weeks of preparation and performance, and the simple freedom to find joy without constant fear of divine judgment. Tomorrow, we'll continue exploring this fascinating world where sacred and secular intertwined in ways both beautiful and terrifying. Close your eyes and let the weight of centuries fade away, leaving only the gentle rhythm of your own breathing and the comfort of a world where holidays are meant to bring peace rather than exhaustion. When dawn finally broke after these marathon holiday celebrations, it brought not relief, but the beginning of yet another layer of medieval holiday complexity. Because you see, the aftermath of a major religious observance was almost as demanding as the celebration itself. The spiritual accounting had to be done, the social debts tallied, and the community's performance evaluated by authorities both earthly and divine. The morning after Christmas or Easter didn't begin with leisurely coffee and leftover turkey sandwiches. It began with mandatory attendance at special Thanksgiving services, where the entire community was expected to demonstrate appropriate gratitude for having survived another major religious observance. These services were themselves elaborate affairs, with specific prayers for different aspects of the celebration, formal acknowledgements of various contributions, and careful assessment of how well the community had honoured God during the festivities. But here's what made the post-holiday period particularly treacherous. This was when the real judgment began. During the celebration itself, people were generally too busy with immediate obligations to scrutinise each other's behaviour closely. But in the quiet days that followed, every gesture, every word, every moment of the holiday was dissected and analysed by neighbours, church authorities, and community leaders looking for evidence of spiritual or social failing. Did Margaret seem insufficiently moved during the reading of the Nativity? Perhaps she was harbouring secret doubts about the virgin birth. Did Thomas take too large a portion of the Christmas pudding? Clearly he was struggling with the sin of gluttony. Did the baker's wife appear too jolly during the solemn parts of the service? She might be possessed by spirits of frivolity that needed to be exorcised through prayer and penance. These post-holiday evaluations weren't casual gossip sessions. They were serious community business that could have lasting consequences for individuals and families. Social standing, business relationships, marriage prospects, and even legal status could all be affected by how your holiday performance was judged by the community. A poorly received celebration could follow you for years, marking you as spiritually suspect or socially unreliable. The church kept its own records of holiday observance, noting who attended which services, who made appropriate donations, who participated enthusiastically in communal activities, and who seemed to be going through the motions without genuine spiritual engagement. These ecclesiastical report cards influenced everything from your eligibility for certain sacraments to your access to church charity during times of need. The economic aftermath of medieval holidays was equally complex and often devastating. Families might spend months of income on a single major celebration, investing in special foods, appropriate clothing, and mandatory gifts that left them financially vulnerable for the rest of the year. The pressure to celebrate appropriately often led to debt, strained relationships, and genuine hardship in the months following major holidays. But you couldn't simply opt out of this financial strain. Attempting to celebrate too modestly was almost as dangerous as celebrating too lavishly. A family that failed to demonstrate appropriate holiday generosity might find themselves excluded from community support networks, business partnerships, and social connections that were essential for survival in medieval society. It was a cruel paradox. You had to spend money you couldn't afford to maintain relationships you couldn't survive without. The physical recovery from these extended celebrations was its own ordeal. Medieval people weren't accustomed to the rich foods and abundant alcohol that characterized holiday feasting. After weeks of normal diet consisting mainly of bread, porridge, and thin soup, suddenly consuming roasted meats, elaborate pastries, and strong wines often resulted in serious digestive distress that could last for days or even weeks. The medical understanding of the time attributed these post-holiday ailments to spiritual rather than physical causes. If you became ill after Christmas, it might be because you had celebrated with insufficient piety, allowing demons of indigestion to enter your body. If you felt melancholy after Easter, it could be interpreted as evidence that you hadn't properly appreciated the resurrection of Christ, and your sadness was divine punishment for spiritual inadequacy. The treatments for these post-holiday ailments were often worse than the symptoms. Bloodletting was commonly prescribed for the physical discomfort that followed rich holiday meals. Purging with various herbal concoctions was recommended for those who seemed spiritually, as well as physically sluggish after celebrations. Extended fasting was often imposed as both medical treatment and spiritual discipline for those whose holiday behavior was deemed excessive. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of medieval holiday aftermath was the inevitable sense of spiritual inadequacy that followed these intense celebrations. No matter how perfectly you had performed during the holiday observances, no matter how genuinely moved you had felt during religious services, there was always the nagging fear that you hadn't done enough, felt enough, or demonstrated sufficient devotion to satisfy divine expectations. The Church deliberately cultivated this sense of spiritual inadequacy, teaching that earthly celebrations were pale shadows of heavenly glory, that human joy was necessarily tainted by sin, and that even the most perfect holiday observance fell short of what God deserved. This meant that the end of every major celebration brought not satisfaction, but anxiety about whether you had honored God adequately or had somehow offended divine sensibilities through insufficient reverence. The transition back to ordinary time after major holidays was jarring and often deeply depressing. The brief period of relative abundance, community solidarity, and spiritual intensity would end abruptly, leaving people to face the harsh realities of medieval daily life, with the memory of something better still fresh in their minds. The contrast between holiday plenty and everyday scarcity was deliberate, designed to remind people that earthly pleasures were temporary, and that true fulfillment could only be found in the afterlife. This psychological manipulation was particularly cruel during the dark winter months when most major Christian holidays occurred. Just when people most needed comfort and joy to survive the bleakest time of year, they were reminded that their brief moments of celebration were insufficient, sinful, or spiritually dangerous. The holiday joy was deliberately poisoned with guilt, ensuring that people would never feel truly satisfied with earthly pleasures. The children who had struggled through these demanding celebrations often emerged from them changed, marked by the intensity of the experience and the constant pressure to perform adult levels of piety and self-control. Many developed lasting anxieties about religious observance, social performance, and spiritual adequacy that would shape their entire adult lives. The holidays that were supposed to celebrate divine love and community joy instead became sources of chronic stress and spiritual insecurity. The servants and lower-class workers who had labored to make these celebrations possible faced their own particular form of post-holiday punishment. After working for days or weeks with minimal rest to serve the elaborate needs of holiday celebrations, they were often dismissed or relegated to reduced roles once the festivities ended. Their exhaustion and physical ailments were ignored, their contributions forgotten, their sacrifices unacknowledged by the very people whose celebrations they had made possible. The women who had done most of the actual work of holiday preparation, cooking, serving, and cleanup, found themselves particularly vulnerable in the aftermath. While men received credit for organizing successful celebrations, women faced criticism for any aspect that hadn't met community standards. A poorly seasoned dish, a wrinkled tablecloth, or an insufficient display of holiday decorations could result in lasting damage to a woman's reputation as a proper household manager. The seasonal depression that often follows modern holidays was magnified enormously in medieval times, when people had no understanding of the psychological effects of dramatic changes in activity level, diet, and social interaction. The post-holiday melancholy that settled over communities was interpreted through religious and moral frameworks that blamed individual spiritual failings rather than recognizing natural human responses to intense celebration, followed by inevitable letdown. The return to normal work routines after extended holiday celebrations was complicated by the fact that many people were still physically and emotionally exhausted from weeks of intense observance. Productivity dropped, accidents increased, and social tensions rose as communities struggled to readjust to ordinary time. Yet there was no accommodation for this transition period, no recognition that people might need time to recover from their celebrations. The debt and financial strain caused by holiday expenses often led to increased conflict within families and communities. Marriages faced additional stress as couples argued about money spent on celebrations. Parents resented children whose holiday demands had strained family resources, and neighbors competed over who had managed to celebrate most appropriately despite limited means. The joy of the season was quickly forgotten in the face of practical consequences that could last for months, and looming over all of this post-holiday exhaustion and anxiety was the knowledge that it would all happen again. The church calendar was relentless, with major holidays occurring throughout the year, each demanding similar levels of preparation, performance, and community participation. There was no escape from this cycle of celebration and recovery, no way to opt out of the demanding rhythm of medieval religious observance. The spring holidays brought their own particular challenges, occurring during the difficult months when winter food stores were running low, but new crops had not yet been harvested. Easter celebrations, with their elaborate requirements for special foods and extended observances, often pushed families to the brink of starvation. The irony was brutal. Celebrating the resurrection of Christ might literally threaten your own survival. Summer holidays, while less physically demanding due to better weather, brought different pressures related to agricultural work that couldn't be postponed. The timing of religious observances rarely aligned with the practical needs of farming communities, creating constant tension between spiritual obligations and economic survival. Miss church for harvest work, and you faced religious consequences. Neglect harvest for church, and you faced starvation. Let your mind drift now, dear listener, away from these cycles of celebration and anxiety that defined medieval life. Feel your breathing slow and deepen as you sink into the comfort of your modern bed, grateful for holidays that end when you want them to, celebrations that don't require community performance, and the freedom to find joy without constant fear of judgment. Close your eyes and imagine those exhausted medieval communities finally finding rest after their demanding celebrations, their worries about spiritual adequacy fading into the gentle darkness of sleep. Tomorrow, we'll continue exploring this complex world where every moment of joy came wrapped in obligation, where every celebration was a test of faith and community standing. Rest peacefully tonight, thankful for the simple pleasure of holidays that bring comfort rather than stress, celebration rather than surveillance, and joy without the weight of eternal consequences hanging over every moment of happiness. But even as communities slowly recovered from major holidays, the medieval calendar offered no respite. The rhythm of religious observance was relentless, with saints' days, feast days, and minor celebrations scattered throughout the year like spiritual landmines waiting to demand attention, preparation, and performance. Modern people might imagine these smaller observances as welcome breaks from the intensity of major holidays, but in medieval times, every saint's day brought its own requirements, its own opportunities for spiritual and social failure. Consider the feast of Saint Blaise in February, when all the candles in the church had to be blessed and people lined up to have their throats blessed to prevent choking or throat ailments in the coming year. This wasn't a brief, casual ceremony. It required specific preparations, appropriate donations to the church, and the right level of faith and reverence from participants. Miss the blessing because you were ill or working, and you'd spend the entire year worried that any cough or sore throat was divine punishment for your absence. The Feast of St. Valentine, far from being a romantic celebration, was primarily about protection from epilepsy and plague. Communities would organize processions, special masses, and collective prayers that demanded participation from everyone who wanted to remain in good standing. The sick would be brought on stretchers to receive special blessings, and families would compete to demonstrate the most appropriate level of concern for community health and spiritual welfare. Each month brought its own collection of saints to honor, miracles to commemorate, and protective rituals to perform. St. Joseph's feast in March required special attention to carpentry and craftsmanship, with tools blessed and workshops sanctified. St. George's Day in April demanded elaborate ceremonies involving horses, weapons, and military displays that could bankrupt smaller communities trying to mount appropriate observances. The spring planting season was particularly fraught with religious obligations. Every stage of agricultural work required specific blessings, prayers, and ritual observances. The blessing of seeds, the sanctification of plows, the prayers for rain or sunshine, the protection of crops from pests and disease, all of these demanded community participation and individual demonstration of faith. A failed harvest could be blamed on insufficient piety during planting rituals, making every farmer acutely aware that their family's survival depended not just on their agricultural skill, but on their spiritual performance. May brought the complex observances surrounding the Virgin Mary, with elaborate flower festivals, processions of young girls dressed as angels, and competitions among families to create the most beautiful floral displays. These celebrations required months of preparation, with special clothes to be sewn, flowers to be cultivated or gathered, and musical performances to be rehearsed. Children who forgot their lines during these performances didn't just embarrass their families. They potentially disrupted the entire community's spiritual offering to the Mother of God. The summer solstice period was dominated by the Feast of St. John the Baptist, which involved bonfires that had to be lit in precise patterns, special foods that required rare ingredients, and nighttime rituals that kept entire communities awake for days. The bonfires weren't just festive gatherings. They were protective ceremonies designed to ward off evil spirits that were thought to be particularly active during the longest day of the year. Every household was expected to contribute fuel for the fires and to participate in the overnight vigils that accompanied them. The harvest season brought its own cascade of religious obligations, with different saints governing different crops and different stages of the gathering process. St. Lawrence protected against fire during grain drying. St. Bartholomew oversaw the grape harvest, and countless other saints required recognition and propitiation to ensure successful preservation of food for the winter months. Miss any of these observances, and crop failure could be attributed to your spiritual negligence. But perhaps most exhausting of all were the frequent fast days that punctuated the medieval calendar like spiritual speed bumps, forcing communities to abruptly shift from celebration to deprivation without warning or preparation. These weren't the gentle, voluntary fasts of modern religious practice. They were mandatory community observances that could be called at any time by church authorities responding to natural disasters, military threats, or signs of divine displeasure. A typical fast day began before dawn with special penitential services that could last for hours. Participants were required to demonstrate appropriate sorrow for their sins and the sins of the community, which meant weeping, wailing, and public displays of remorse that had to appear genuine to observers. The line between authentic spiritual contrition and theatrical performance was carefully monitored by church officials who had extensive experience in detecting insufficient penitence. The actual fasting was far more severe than modern people might imagine. Complete abstinence from food and drink for 24 hours or longer was common, with pregnant women, children, and the elderly expected to participate according to their capacity. Water was sometimes permitted, but often only after sunset, and the definition of food was strictly interpreted to exclude even small tastes or medicinal preparations that might contain nourishment. The physical effects of these frequent fasts were severe, particularly for people already living on marginal diets. Fainting during religious services was common, and the line between spiritual ecstasy and simple starvation-induced hallucinations was often impossible to draw. People reported visions, divine communications, and mystical experiences during extended fasts. But whether these were genuine spiritual phenomena or symptoms of severe hunger was a question that troubled medieval theologians. The breaking of fasts was as ritualized as the fasting itself, with specific foods required in specific orders and elaborate prayers accompanying each stage of returning to normal eating. Rush the process, choose the wrong foods, or fail to demonstrate appropriate gratitude for the end of the fast, and you'd face criticism for spiritual impatience or insufficient appreciation of divine mercy. The social pressure during fast days was enormous, with community members watching each other for signs of secret eating or insufficient commitment to the penitential process. Accusations of breaking fast could destroy reputations and result in severe public penance that might last for months. The temptation to cheat was constant, but the consequences of being caught were so severe that most people endured genuine hunger rather than risk social and spiritual condemnation. Children during fast days faced their own particular torment. They were expected to understand and participate in community penance for sins they couldn't comprehend, suffering hunger as punishment for offences they hadn't committed. Parents struggled with the impossible choice between protecting their children's health and demonstrating proper spiritual discipline, knowing that either choice could result in community criticism. The timing of these fast days seemed deliberately designed to maximize hardship. They often coincided with periods when food was already scarce, when physical labor demands were highest, or when other stresses were already straining community resources. A fast called during harvest time meant that crucial agricultural work had to be performed by people weakened by hunger, increasing the risk of accidents and reducing productivity when it was most needed. The psychological effects of frequent fasting extended far beyond the immediate physical discomfort. Medieval people developed complex relationships with food that mixed guilt, anxiety, and spiritual significance in ways that would be recognized today as profoundly unhealthy. Eating became a moral act rather than a biological necessity, with every bite evaluated for its spiritual implications and social appropriateness. The end of major fasting periods brought relief, but also anxiety about whether the community's penance had been sufficient to address whatever crisis had prompted the fast. Natural disasters, military defeats, or continuing hardships after a fast could be interpreted as evidence that the community hadn't demonstrated adequate contrition, leading to calls for even more severe penitential observances. The medical understanding of fasting was primitive and often dangerous. Medieval physicians believed that hunger purified not just the soul, but the body, purging harmful humors and restoring spiritual and physical balance. Treatments for illness often included extended fasting that weakened patients when they most needed nutrition. But questioning these medical spiritual practices was seen as evidence of insufficient faith in divine healing. The economic impact of frequent fasting was significant, as communities lost productive work days to religious observance while still needing to maintain the same level of output to survive. The irregular nature of called fasts made planning impossible, as no one knew when normal work schedules might be interrupted by mandatory spiritual observances that could last for days or weeks. Women faced particular challenges during fasting periods, as they were still expected to prepare meals for those exempt from fasting while abstaining themselves. The psychological torture of cooking food you couldn't eat, serving meals to others while suffering hunger, and maintaining appropriate spiritual demeanor throughout was a burden that fell disproportionately on medieval women. The seasonal cycle of fasts followed its own cruel logic, with the most severe penitential periods occurring during the months when food was naturally scarcest. Lent fell during the late winter when stored food supplies were running low. Advent fasting coincided with the approach of winter, when preservation of calories was most crucial for survival. The timing seemed designed to test faith through genuine physical hardship rather than mere inconvenience. Let your breathing deepen now, dear listener, as you sink further into the comfort of your warm bed, grateful for the freedom to eat when hungry, to celebrate without community surveillance, and to find spiritual meaning without the constant threat of public judgment. The weight of these medieval obligations grows heavy even in imagination, the relentless cycle of performance and penance exhausting to contemplate from our modern perspective. Close your eyes and let the complexity of that ancient world fade into the gentle rhythm of your own breath. Tomorrow, we'll continue exploring this demanding landscape where every day brought new spiritual challenges, where the calendar itself was a source of anxiety rather than comfort, and where the simple act of surviving from one season to the next required constant negotiation with divine and human authorities who were never fully satisfied with mortal efforts at devotion. Rest peacefully tonight, thankful for holidays that end when you choose, celebrations that bring joy without obligation, and the simple blessing of living in a time when your spiritual life belongs to you alone. The saints' days that dotted the medieval calendar like theological stepping stones weren't gentle reminders of holy lives well lived. They were demanding performances that required communities to demonstrate their devotion through increasingly elaborate displays of faith, sacrifice, and communal participation. Each saint's feast brought its own peculiar requirements, its own opportunities for spiritual failure, and its own methods of testing whether your community truly deserved divine protection. Saint Agnes, in January, demanded special attention to young girls and their purity, with elaborate ceremonies involving the blessing of lambs, whose wool would be woven into sacred vestments. But these weren't simple pastoral celebrations. Families with daughters of marriageable age faced intense scrutiny during these observances, as their participation was interpreted as evidence of their commitment to proper Christian values regarding female virtue and family honor. The preparation for St. Agnes' Day began weeks in advance, with families competing to provide the whitest, most perfect lambs for the ceremony. The animals had to be specially cared for, fed particular foods, and kept in states of ritual purity that required constant vigilance. A lamb that became injured or ill before the ceremony could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure with the offering family, potentially affecting their daughter's marriage prospects and social standing for years to come. February brought St. Agatha, protector against fire and earthquakes, whose feast required communities to organize elaborate processions, carrying blessed candles and sacred relics through every street and building. These weren't casual walks through town. They were precisely choreographed ritual processions where every step had meaning. Every participant had a specific role, and any deviation from established protocol could be seen as inviting the very disasters the saint was supposed to prevent. The logistics of these processions were nightmarish. Routes had to be planned to include every household, every shop, every barn and workshop in the community. Timing had to be calculated to ensure that the sacred objects reached each location at the spiritually appropriate moment. Weather conditions had to be considered, because rain or snow that interrupted a protection ritual could be interpreted as evidence that the community's faith was insufficient to merit divine assistance. The blessed candles carried during these processions weren't ordinary church candles. They were special objects that had been prepared through elaborate rituals involving specific prayers, particular types of wax, and precise timing related to lunar cycles and feast day calendars. Creating these candles required specialized knowledge that was closely guarded by church authorities, and any mistake in their preparation could invalidate the entire protective ceremony. But the real pressure fell on the participants in these processions, who had to maintain appropriate levels of reverence and concentration throughout ceremonies that could last for 8 or 10 hours. Stumble while carrying a sacred relic, allow your attention to wander during crucial prayers, or show signs of fatigue that might be interpreted as insufficient devotion, and you'd face accusations of compromising the spiritual protection of the entire community. The spring months brought an accelerating cascade of saints' days, each with increasingly complex requirements as communities prepared for the crucial growing season. St. Patrick in March wasn't just about Irish heritage. He was the patron saint of protection against snakes and poisonous creatures, requiring elaborate ceremonies involving the blessing of fields, gardens, and livestock areas where dangerous animals might threaten crops and people. These blessing ceremonies required precise timing based on agricultural calendars that most people didn't fully understand. Bless the fields too early and late frosts might destroy the protection. Bless them too late, and planting might proceed without divine assistance. The responsibility for calculating these timing issues fell on local priests, who often lacked the astronomical knowledge necessary to make accurate predictions, but faced severe criticism if their timing proved wrong. The blessed water used in these ceremonies had to be prepared through elaborate rituals that began days before the actual blessing events. Special vessels were required, particular prayers had to be recited at specific times, and the water itself had to come from sources that had been ritually purified. A priest who used improperly prepared water for field blessings might find himself blamed for any crop failures that occurred during the growing season. April's feast of St. Mark brought its own particular terror in the form of the major litanies, elaborate processional prayers that were supposed to protect crops from pests, disease, and weather damage. But these weren't gentle requests for divine assistance. They were intensive, community-wide rituals that required every able-bodied person to participate in day-long processions that covered every inch of agricultural land in the area. The physical demands of these processions were enormous. Participants had to walk for miles carrying heavy banners, sacred objects, and ritual implements while maintaining constant prayer and appropriate spiritual demeanor. The elderly and infirm were carried on stretchers or in carts, because absence from these protective ceremonies was considered tantamount to inviting agricultural disaster on the entire community. The route of the major litanies had to be precisely planned to ensure that every field, every garden, every orchard received appropriate spiritual protection. Missing even a small plot could result in that area becoming the entry point for crop-destroying pests or diseases that might spread throughout the region. The pressure on local leaders to plan these routes correctly was enormous, as any oversight could have catastrophic consequences for community survival. The prayers recited during these processions weren't brief, simple requests for blessing. They were elaborate liturgical formulations that had to be pronounced correctly, with proper inflection and timing, by participants who often didn't understand the Latin words they were speaking. Mispronounce a crucial prayer, skip a required response, or allow your voice to falter during important invocations, and the spiritual protection for that section of the procession route might be compromised. May brought the feast of Saint Isidore, patron of farmers, which required elaborate ceremonies involving the blessing of agricultural tools, seeds, and work animals. But these blessings weren't simple requests for good fortune. They were complex rituals that transformed ordinary farming implements into sacred objects that had to be handled with reverence and maintained according to strict spiritual protocols throughout the growing season. The preparation of tools for blessing required extensive cleaning, repair, and sometimes decoration with religious symbols that had to be applied according to precise specifications. A plough that wasn't properly prepared for blessing might not receive full divine protection, potentially resulting in poor furrows, uneven planting, or equipment failures at crucial moments in the agricultural cycle. The blessed seeds used for planting carried their own burden of spiritual responsibility. They had to be stored in specially prepared containers, planted according to ritually prescribed methods, and tended with constant awareness that their growth depended on maintaining proper spiritual as well as agricultural practices. A farmer who cursed while working with blessed seeds, who worked on forbidden days, or who failed to maintain appropriate reverence while tending his crops, might find his entire harvest compromised by spiritual negligence. The work animals blessed during these ceremonies became sacred partners in agricultural labor, requiring special care and treatment that went far beyond normal animal husbandry. Blessed oxen couldn't be beaten with ordinary switches. They required specially prepared driving tools. Blessed horses couldn't be fed common fodder during certain periods. They needed grain that had been ritually purified. The additional expense and complexity of maintaining these spiritually enhanced animals often pushed farming families to the edge of financial ruin. The summer solstice period brought the feast of St. John the Baptist, which required elaborate fire ceremonies that posed genuine dangers to communities built primarily of wood and thatch. The bonfires weren't casual celebrations. They were precisely constructed ritual fires that had to burn in specific patterns, reach particular heights, and be maintained for exact periods of time to provide proper spiritual protection for the community. The preparation for these midsummer fires began weeks in advance, with families required to contribute specific types of fuel based on complex calculations involving their social status, the number of people in their household, and their previous year's harvest yields. Poor families might be forced to burn furniture or even parts of their houses to meet their fire contribution requirements, while wealthy families faced pressure to demonstrate appropriate generosity through elaborate fuel donations. The nighttime vigils that accompanied these fires required participants to remain awake and spiritually alert throughout the shortest night of the year, maintaining constant prayers and ritual observances, while tending fires that could easily spread and destroy the entire community. The exhaustion from these all-night ceremonies left people vulnerable to accidents and illness, but sleeping during the vigil was considered a serious spiritual offense that could compromise the protective power of the entire celebration. The harvest season brought St. Lawrence in August, protector against fire during grain drying, whose feast required elaborate ceremonies involving the blessing of granaries, storage facilities, and preservation equipment. But these weren't simple requests for successful food storage. They were complex rituals that transformed ordinary storage buildings into sacred spaces that had to be maintained according to strict spiritual protocols throughout the winter months. The preparation of granaries for blessing required extensive cleaning and purification that went far beyond normal sanitation practices. Every surface had to be scrubbed with water that had been blessed according to specific formulas, dried with cloths that had been consecrated through particular rituals, and decorated with religious symbols that had to be renewed at regular intervals throughout the storage season. The blessed grain stored in these sanctified facilities couldn't be handled casually. Special prayers had to be recited when moving grain, particular tools had to be used for measuring and distribution, and constant vigilance had to be maintained to ensure that the stored food didn't become contaminated by spiritual as well as physical impurities. A family that failed to maintain proper reverence while handling their blessed grain stores might find their winter food supply mysteriously spoiled or infested with pests. September brought St. Michael, protector against demons and evil spirits, whose feast required elaborate exorcism ceremonies that were supposed to cleanse communities of spiritual threats that had accumulated during the year. But these weren't gentle blessing rituals. They were intensive spiritual warfare exercises that required participants to confront and banish malevolent forces that were believed to be actively working to destroy their community. The preparation for these exorcism ceremonies involved elaborate fasting and purification rituals that left participants physically and emotionally vulnerable to the intense spiritual experiences that were expected to occur during the actual ceremonies. People reported dramatic encounters with evil spirits, terrifying visions of demonic attacks, and overwhelming sensations of spiritual battle that could last for hours or even days. The line between genuine spiritual experience and mass hysteria during these ceremonies was often impossible to draw. Participants who didn't report appropriate spiritual encounters might be suspected of spiritual dryness or even demonic influence themselves, while those who reported too dramatic experiences might be accused of pride or attention-seeking. Finding the right level of spiritual engagement required careful observation of community expectations and skilled performance of appropriate religious emotion. As autumn deepened into winter, the cycle of saints' days continued relentlessly, each bringing its own demands, its own opportunities for failure, and its own methods of testing community faith. The cumulative effect of these constant religious obligations was exhausting, leaving people spiritually depleted and financially strained long before the major holiday seasons arrived to demand even greater displays of devotion and community participation. Let your eyelids grow heavy now, dear listener, as you contemplate this relentless calendar of spiritual performance that governed every aspect of medieval life. Feel your shoulders releasing the tension of imagining these constant obligations, your breathing deepening as you sink into the comfort of a world where your spiritual life belongs to you alone, where celebrations bring joy rather than anxiety, where the calendar serves your needs rather than demanding constant sacrifice. Close your eyes and imagine those exhausted medieval communities finally finding brief moments of rest between saints' days, their worries about spiritual adequacy fading into the gentle darkness of sleep. Rest peacefully tonight, grateful for holidays that end when you choose, celebrations that don't require community performance, and the simple blessing of living in a time when your devotion is measured by your own heart rather than your neighbor's scrutiny. The winter saints brought their own particular brand of spiritual terror, arriving just when communities were most vulnerable to cold, hunger, and the creeping despair that came with shortened days and dwindling food stores. December's St. Nicholas, far from being the jolly gift-giver of modern imagination, was a stern judge of charity whose feast required elaborate demonstrations of generosity that often bankrupted families trying to prove their Christian virtue. The Nicholas celebrations weren't about children receiving presents. They were about adults being tested on their willingness to give away resources they desperately needed for winter survival. Families were expected to provide food for the poor, clothing for the naked, and shelter for the homeless, all while their own stores ran dangerously low and their own children shivered in inadequate garments. The pressure to demonstrate appropriate charity was enormous, because St. Nicholas was believed to keep careful records of every act of giving and withholding. Fail to be sufficiently generous during his feast, and you might find your own family facing starvation or freezing before spring arrived. But give too much, and you'd be accused of pride or of trying to buy salvation through ostentatious display rather than genuine Christian love. The gift-giving that did occur during Nicholas celebrations followed strict hierarchical protocols that reinforced social divisions rather than promoting holiday joy. Servants received small tokens from their masters, but these weren't expressions of affection. They were carefully calculated demonstrations of noblesse oblige that reminded everyone of their proper place in the social order, while creating debt relationships that could be called upon throughout the year. Children, during St. Nicholas celebrations, faced their own form of spiritual evaluation, as the saint was believed to judge their behavior throughout the year and deliver appropriate rewards or punishments. But these weren't gentle moral lessons about being good. They were terrifying encounters with divine judgment that could determine a child's fate for the entire coming year. The traditional questioning of children during Nicholas celebrations involved detailed interrogation about their obedience, their prayers, their treatment of siblings and animals, and their secret thoughts and desires. A child who gave wrong answers, showed insufficient remorse for minor infractions, or appeared too proud of their good behavior might be marked for spiritual correction that could involve fasting, extra prayers, or even physical penance. The Feast of St. Lucy in mid-December brought its own challenges, as communities prepared for the longest night of the year with elaborate light ceremonies that required enormous quantities of candles, oil, and fuel that families could barely afford. These weren't cheerful celebrations of returning light. They were desperate attempts to ward off the spiritual darkness that was believed to reach its peak during the winter solstice period. The preparation for Lucy celebrations required weeks of candle making, oil pressing, and fuel gathering that consumed time and resources when both were most precious. Families had to choose between heating their homes and providing adequate illumination for the protective ceremonies, often leaving their own living spaces cold and dark, while contributing to community displays of light. The actual Lucy Vigil required participants to maintain constant illumination throughout the longest night, taking turns tending candles and fires that couldn't be allowed to go out without potentially catastrophic spiritual consequences. The exhaustion from these sleepless nights, combined with the cold and the strain of constant vigilance, often led to illness and accidents that plagued communities throughout the remaining winter months. But perhaps most demanding of all were the Ember Days, quarterly periods of fasting and special observance that occurred 4 times throughout the year, always at the most inconvenient possible moments. These weren't single-day fasts, but extended periods of deprivation and intensified spiritual practice that could last for weeks, disrupting normal work patterns and social relationships, just when communities needed stability most. The autumn Ember Days fell during harvest time, requiring farmers to interrupt crucial agricultural work for extended periods of prayer and fasting. The winter Ember Days occurred during the coldest months, when people most needed caloric intake to maintain body heat. The spring Ember Days coincided with planting season, when physical strength was essential for survival. The summer Ember Days arrived during the most demanding period of agricultural labour, when any reduction in work capacity could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. The fasting requirements during Ember Days went beyond simple abstinence from food. Participants were expected to avoid all forms of earthly pleasure, including comfortable clothing, warm fires, marital relations, and even casual conversation that wasn't directly related to spiritual improvement. The goal was to create a state of total focus on divine matters, but the practical effect was often to create communities of exhausted, irritable, spiritually anxious people who were barely functional. The special church services during Ember Days could last for 10 or 12 hours, requiring participants to stand, kneel, and prostrate themselves according to complex liturgical choreography, while maintaining constant attention to prayers and readings they might not understand. Elderly people collapsed, children cried from hunger and fatigue, and adults struggled to maintain appropriate spiritual demeanor while dealing with the physical effects of prolonged fasting and sleep deprivation. The ordination ceremonies that traditionally occurred during Ember Days added another layer of community stress, as local young men were examined for fitness to join the priesthood through processes that could expose family secrets, financial irregularities, and moral failings that had been carefully hidden throughout the year. A son rejected for ordination could bring lasting shame on his entire family, while a son accepted faced the prospect of leaving his family forever to serve the church. The seasonal work restrictions during these Ember periods often created impossible conflicts between spiritual obligations and economic survival. Crops that needed immediate attention couldn't wait for the end of religious observances. Animals that required daily care couldn't be neglected for spiritual reasons. Weather conditions that created urgent repair needs didn't respect the church calendar's demands for contemplative withdrawal from worldly concerns. Women faced particular hardships during Ember Days, as they were still expected to maintain household functions while participating in the same fasting and prayer requirements as men. Cooking meals for family members who were exempt from fasting while abstaining themselves, caring for children while weakened by hunger, and managing household crises while maintaining spiritual focus created levels of stress that often resulted in physical and emotional breakdowns. The confession requirements during Ember Days involved detailed examination of conscience that could take hours or even days to complete properly. Penitents were expected to recall and confess every sin committed since their last confession, not just major transgressions, but minor failings, impure thoughts, moments of spiritual dryness, and insufficient enthusiasm for religious observances. The penance assigned after these elaborate confessions could be severe enough to affect the penitent's life for months or even years. Extra prayers, additional fasting, pilgrimages to distant shrines, generous donations to the church, and public displays of humility were common penances that created ongoing spiritual and financial burdens long after the Ember Days themselves had ended. The psychological effects of these quarterly periods of intensified spiritual pressure were cumulative and often devastating. People developed chronic anxiety about their spiritual state, obsessive concerns about minor moral failings, and deep depression from the constant cycle of self-examination and penance. The brief periods of normal life between Ember Days were spent in growing dread of the next approaching season of spiritual trial. The community surveillance during Ember Days was particularly intense, as neighbours watched each other for signs of insufficient commitment to the fasting and prayer requirements. Accusations of secret eating, inadequate spiritual fervour, or excessive concern with worldly matters could result in public shaming, additional penance, or even formal charges of spiritual negligence that could affect a person's standing in the community for years. The weather seemed to conspire against these quarterly observances, with storms, extreme temperatures, and other challenging conditions, often coinciding with the most demanding periods of spiritual practice. A blizzard during winter, Ember Days didn't excuse absence from lengthy church services. Flooding during spring observances didn't release communities from their obligation to maintain outdoor processions and ceremonies. The economic impact of these regular disruptions to normal work patterns was severe, as communities lost productive time just when they could least afford it while still needing to maintain the same level of output to survive. The irregular timing of Ember Days made planning impossible, as no one could predict exactly when normal activities would be interrupted by mandatory spiritual observances. The physical health consequences of quarterly fasting and sleep deprivation were serious and often lasting. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and stress-related illnesses were common during and after Ember Day observances, but seeking medical treatment for conditions caused by religious practice was itself seen as evidence of insufficient faith and spiritual commitment. The children born and raised in this system of quarterly spiritual intensity often developed lasting psychological patterns of anxiety, perfectionism, and religious obsession that shaped their entire adult lives. They learned to live in constant fear of spiritual inadequacy, always preparing for the next period of testing, never feeling secure in their relationship with divine authority. As winter deepened and the year drew toward its close, communities faced the approach of Advent with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The 4 weeks of preparation for Christmas weren't a gentle countdown to celebration, but an intensive period of spiritual preparation that demanded constant vigilance, perfect behavior, and increasing levels of devotional practice that left people exhausted before the actual holiday season even began. The Advent fasting requirements were severe, involving not just restriction of food, but elimination of all forms of entertainment, luxury, and personal comfort. Music was forbidden except for specific liturgical chants. Dancing was prohibited entirely. Even conversation was supposed to focus exclusively on spiritual matters and preparation for the coming celebration of Christ's birth. The special Advent services began before dawn each day and continued throughout the evening, leaving little time for normal work or family life. The liturgy during this period was particularly complex and demanding, requiring congregation members to memorize new prayers, learn special responses, and participate in elaborate ceremonies that grew more intricate as Christmas approached. Let your breathing slow now, dear listener, as you sink deeper into your comfortable bed, grateful for the simple freedom to celebrate or not celebrate as your heart desires. The weight of these endless religious obligations grows heavy, even in imagination, the relentless cycle of performance and penance exhausting to contemplate from our modern perspective of choice and personal autonomy. Close your eyes and let these ancient anxieties fade into the gentle darkness of voluntary rest. Tomorrow, we'll continue exploring this demanding world where every season brought new tests of faith, where the calendar itself was a source of spiritual anxiety rather than comfort, and where the simple passage of time required constant negotiation with divine and human authorities, who were never quite satisfied with mortal efforts at devotion. Rest peacefully tonight, thankful for holidays that serve your needs rather than demanding your service, for celebrations that end when you choose, and for the precious freedom to find spiritual meaning in your own way, in your own time, without the constant weight of community surveillance and eternal judgment pressing down on every moment of joy. The approach of Christmas itself, after weeks of Advent preparation, didn't bring the relief you might expect. Instead, it marked the beginning of the most demanding and scrutinized period of the entire medieval year. The Christmas season wasn't a single day of celebration, followed by peaceful recovery. It was a 12-day marathon of religious observance that tested every aspect of community faith, social cohesion, and individual spiritual endurance. Christmas Eve began not with cozy family gatherings, but with mandatory participation in the most solemn and lengthy church service of the year. The Midnight Mass wasn't a brief, candlelit ceremony designed for quiet reflection. It was an elaborate, hours-long ritual that began well before midnight and continued deep into Christmas morning, demanding perfect attention and appropriate spiritual response from congregations who were already exhausted from weeks of Advent preparation. The church building itself became a test of faith during these winter services. Stone walls that provided blessed coolness during summer became ice-cold chambers where breath froze and fingers went numb while trying to hold prayer books. The floors were often covered with rushes or straw for insulation, but these quickly became sodden with melted snow tracked in by hundreds of feet, creating a cold, damp environment that chilled participants to the bone. The candles that provided the only illumination during these nighttime services were expensive, precious commodities that communities could barely afford. Each candle represented a significant investment of resources that might otherwise have gone toward food or fuel for heating. Yet the symbolic importance of maintaining constant light throughout the Christmas vigil was so great that families would go without heat in their own homes to contribute to the church's illumination needs. The music during Christmas services was particularly demanding, requiring choir members and congregational participants to perform complex polyphonic arrangements that had been practiced for months. These weren't simple, familiar carols that everyone could sing together. They were intricate musical compositions that required precise timing, correct pitch, and perfect coordination among dozens or even hundreds of voices. A single wrong note or missed entrance could disrupt the entire musical offering and be interpreted as evidence of insufficient preparation or dedication. The incense burned during Christmas services was another enormous expense that strained community resources. The aromatic resins and spices required for proper Christmas incense had to be imported from distant lands at costs that could equal several months of a craftsman's wages. Yet the spiritual significance of creating the proper aromatic environment for Christ's birth celebration was considered so important that communities would go into debt to provide adequate incense for their services. But perhaps most challenging of all was the expectation that every participant in these Christmas services would experience genuine spiritual transformation during the celebration. This wasn't simply a matter of attending church and going through the motions. Medieval theology demanded that Christmas participants undergo authentic encounters with divine mystery, that they feel genuine awe at the incarnation, that they experience real joy at Christ's birth, and that they emerge from the services spiritually renewed and morally improved. The pressure to demonstrate appropriate Christmas emotions was enormous. Appear too solemn during joyful portions of the service, and you'd be suspected of insufficient appreciation for God's gift to humanity. Show too much excitement during reverent moments, and you'd be accused of treating sacred mysteries with inappropriate levity. Finding the exact right emotional tone and maintaining it throughout hours of complex liturgy required exhausting levels of self-monitoring and performance. The Christmas feast that followed these marathon church services was itself a carefully choreographed religious ceremony disguised as a meal. Every dish had symbolic significance that had to be understood and appropriately acknowledged by diners. The roasted meats represented abundance and divine provision, but eating them required prayers of thanksgiving and awareness of those who had no meat. The special breads were shaped and decorated with religious symbols that had to be recognized and honored before consumption. The seating arrangements for Christmas feasts reflected not just social hierarchy, but spiritual status within the community. Those who had demonstrated exceptional piety during Advent preparation might find themselves seated in positions of honor, while those whose spiritual performance had been deemed inadequate were relegated to less prominent places at the table. These assignments were public declarations of each person's standing in the community's spiritual ecosystem. The gift-giving during Christmas was a complex negotiation of social obligations, religious requirements, and economic constraints that could strain relationships and create lasting resentments. The presents themselves weren't expressions of personal affection, but carefully calculated offerings designed to fulfill multiple purposes simultaneously. A gift to your feudal superior had to demonstrate appropriate submission while showcasing your prosperity. A gift to the church had to show proper devotion while remaining within your acknowledged means. A gift to a social equal had to maintain balance in your relationship while avoiding any suggestion of superiority or condescension. The children's role during Christmas celebrations was particularly demanding, as they were expected to serve as living symbols of innocence and purity, while demonstrating adult levels of spiritual understanding and behavioral control. Young people were often dressed as angels for Christmas pageants, but these weren't simple costume parties. They were religious dramas where every gesture, every word, every facial expression carried theological significance and could be interpreted as evidence of the child's spiritual state. The Christmas pageants themselves were elaborate community productions that required months of preparation and perfect execution. The actors weren't professional performers, but ordinary community members who had to memorize lengthy scripts in Latin, coordinate complex staging, and maintain appropriate reverence while portraying sacred figures. A forgotten line during the nativity play could disrupt the entire community's Christmas celebration, while an inappropriate gesture or expression could be seen as blasphemous mockery of holy mysteries. The costumes and sets for these Christmas pageants represented enormous investments of time and resources. The fabric for angel robes had to be white and pure, often requiring special bleaching processes that were time-consuming and expensive. The props had to be crafted with reverent attention to detail, as they would represent sacred objects during the performance. The staging had to be planned to accommodate not just the practical needs of the performance, but the spiritual requirements of presenting holy stories with appropriate dignity. The weather during Christmas celebrations seemed particularly determined to test community faith and endurance. Blizzards that blocked roads and made travel to church services dangerous couldn't excuse absence from mandatory observances. Ice storms that made walking treacherous didn't release communities from their obligation to participate in outdoor processions. Bitter cold that made standing in unheated churches nearly unbearable was accepted as part of the spiritual discipline required for proper Christmas observance. The food preparation for Christmas feasts was a community-wide undertaking that began weeks before the celebration and required coordination among dozens of households. The special Christmas bread had to be prepared according to ancient recipes that involved specific ingredients, particular mixing methods, and exact timing that couldn't be compromised without risking the spiritual significance of the finished product. The Christmas meats had to be selected, blessed, and prepared according to religious protocols that were as important as culinary technique. The preservation of Christmas leftovers was governed by strict rules about appropriate use of blessed food. Bread that had been consecrated during Christmas services couldn't be fed to animals or thrown away like ordinary scraps. Meat from the Christmas feast carried spiritual significance that required it to be distributed to the poor according to precise guidelines about charitable giving. Even the bones and other remnants had to be disposed of with reverence and according to religious customs. The 12 days of Christmas that followed the initial celebration weren't a gradual wind-down from holiday intensity. Each day brought its own specific religious observances, its own requirements for community participation, and its own opportunities for spiritual or social failure. The Feast of Stephen on December 26th required special attention to martyrdom and sacrifice. The Feast of the Holy Innocents on December 28th demanded elaborate ceremonies honouring children and focusing community attention on protection of the vulnerable. The New Year celebrations that occurred during the Christmas season were fraught with theological complexity, as communities struggled to balance acknowledgement of temporal change with focus on eternal spiritual realities. The passage from one year to the next was seen as a moment of particular spiritual vulnerability, when evil forces might gain access to communities that weren't properly protected through prayer and ritual observance. The Epiphany celebrations that concluded the Christmas season on January 6th required elaborate ceremonies involving the blessing of water, chalk, and incense that would provide spiritual protection for the entire coming year. These weren't simple blessing rituals, but complex ceremonies that had to be performed with perfect precision to ensure their effectiveness. The blessed objects would be distributed throughout the community and used in ongoing spiritual practices that required constant vigilance and appropriate reverence. The cleanup after the extended Christmas celebrations was a community undertaking that could take weeks to complete properly. The church had to be restored to its ordinary configuration, with special Christmas decorations removed and stored according to religious protocols. The community spaces used for feasts and pageants had to be cleaned and spiritually purified for return to normal use. The costumes and props from Christmas productions had to be carefully maintained for future use or respectfully disposed of if they had become too worn or damaged. The financial aftermath of Christmas celebrations often left communities struggling with debt and resource depletion that could last for months. Families that had invested heavily in appropriate Christmas observance found themselves facing the lean months of late winter and early spring with depleted stores and limited resources. The pressure to celebrate appropriately during Christmas often created genuine hardship that threatened survival during the most difficult time of the year. The psychological transition from the intensity of Christmas celebration back to ordinary time was jarring and often deeply depressing. The brief period of community solidarity, spiritual intensity, and relative abundance would end abruptly, leaving people to face the harsh realities of medieval winter, with only memories of something better to sustain them. The contrast between Christmas joy and January bleakness was deliberately emphasized by church teachings that reminded people of the temporary nature of earthly pleasures and the permanent reality of spiritual struggle. The evaluation of Christmas celebrations by church and community authorities continued long after the celebrations themselves had ended. Every aspect of the community's Christmas observance would be analysed and discussed, with individuals and families receiving feedback about their participation that could affect their social standing, their access to church services, and their eligibility for various community benefits throughout the coming year. But even as communities slowly recovered from the exhaustion and expense of Christmas celebrations, the relentless wheel of the church calendar continued turning, bringing new saints' days, new feast days, and new opportunities for spiritual testing. The brief respite of ordinary time in January would be interrupted by Candlemas in February, followed by the approach of Lent and the entire cycle of spring religious observances that would test community faith and endurance once again. The cycle never stopped, never offered genuine rest, never allowed communities to simply exist without the constant demand for spiritual performance and religious demonstration. Medieval life was a continuous round of sacred celebrations, each more demanding than the last, each requiring greater sacrifices and more perfect faith, each reminding people that their earthly existence was merely preparation for an eternal judgment that would evaluate every moment of their temporal performance. Let your breathing deepen now, dear listener, as you sink into the blessed simplicity of a world where holidays serve your comfort rather than demanding your sacrifice. Feel the weight of these endless obligations lifting from your shoulders as you drift towards sleep, grateful for celebrations that end when you choose, for spiritual practices that nurture rather than exhaust, and for the precious freedom to find joy without the constant fear of divine or community judgment. Close your eyes and imagine those weary medieval communities finally finding moments of rest between their demanding celebrations, their constant anxieties about spiritual adequacy fading into the gentle darkness of voluntary sleep. Rest peacefully tonight, thankful for holidays that bring peace rather than pressure, celebration rather than surveillance, and joy without the crushing weight of eternal consequences hanging over every moment of earthly happiness. Tomorrow, we'll continue exploring this fascinating world where time itself was measured in spiritual obligations, where the calendar was a source of anxiety rather than anticipation, and where the simple passage of seasons required constant negotiation with divine and human authorities who were never quite satisfied with mortal efforts at perfect devotion. But for now, rest easy in the knowledge that your celebrations belong to you alone. Your joy is yours to give and receive freely, and your spiritual life unfolds according to your own heart's rhythm rather than the demanding drumbeat of communal religious performance. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through history's more challenging celebrations, where every holiday was a test of faith and every feast a performance that could determine your standing with both God and neighbours for years to come. But perhaps the most psychologically exhausting aspect of medieval holiday celebrations was the knowledge that they would all be evaluated, judged, and remembered by the community long after the festivities themselves had ended. Your performance during Christmas wasn't just about getting through the celebration itself. It would become part of your permanent record, a spiritual report card that followed you through the entire year and influenced how you were treated by neighbours, church authorities, and even potential marriage partners. The gossip that followed major holidays was vicious and detailed. Every gesture during church services was dissected and analysed. Every bite taken during feast meals was remembered and discussed. Every word spoken during celebrations was repeated and interpreted for evidence of spiritual health or moral failing. Medieval communities had long memories and sharp tongues, and a poorly received holiday performance could haunt you for decades. Women faced particularly intense scrutiny during and after holiday celebrations, as their behaviour was seen as reflecting not just their own spiritual state, but the moral condition of their entire household. A wife who appeared insufficiently reverent during Christmas Mass brought shame on her husband. A mother whose children misbehaved during Easter services faced accusations of inadequate spiritual instruction. A daughter who seemed too eager during holiday dancing might find her reputation permanently damaged and her marriage prospects destroyed. The elderly during holiday seasons carried the additional burden of serving as living examples of proper Christian devotion for younger community members. Their every action was watched and evaluated as a model of how faithful Christians should approach sacred celebrations. an old person who showed fatigue during lengthy services, who appeared confused by complex rituals, or who seemed less enthusiastic than expected faced accusations of spiritual decline that could affect their access to church charity and community support. The servants and labourers who made these elaborate celebrations possible found themselves in impossible positions during holiday evaluations. They were expected to work tirelessly to create perfect celebrations while simultaneously demonstrating appropriate spiritual engagement with the religious significance of their labour. A cook whose Christmas feast was deemed inadequate might face not just professional consequences, but accusations of insufficient devotion to the sacred season. The children who had struggled through demanding holiday performances often found themselves the subject of intense community discussion about their spiritual development and family upbringing. A child who had forgotten lines during a Christmas pageant wasn't just embarrassed. They became evidence that their parents weren't providing adequate religious instruction. A young person who had seemed bored during lengthy church services might be identified as spiritually at risk and subjected to additional religious education and supervision. But beyond the immediate social consequences of holiday performance evaluations, medieval people lived with the constant awareness that their celebration behaviour was being recorded in divine ledgers that would determine their eternal fate. Every moment of insufficient enthusiasm, every lapse in attention during prayer, every bite taken without proper gratitude was believed to be noted by heavenly authorities who would eventually demand a complete accounting of earthly spiritual performance. The theological implications of holiday celebrations were staggering in their complexity and consequence. Christmas wasn't just about celebrating Christ's birth. It was about demonstrating that you truly understood and accepted the mystery of the Incarnation. Easter wasn't simply about resurrection joy. It was about proving that you had genuinely died to sin and been reborn in spiritual purity. Every holiday was a theological examination where failure could result in eternal damnation. The pressure to maintain perfect spiritual focus during these celebrations was crushing. Medieval theology taught that moments of distraction during sacred observances were opportunities for demonic influence, that wandering thoughts during prayer were evidence of spiritual weakness, and that insufficient emotional response to religious mysteries indicated a soul in mortal danger. The line between normal human limitations and spiritual failure was razor-thin and constantly monitored. The physical exhaustion that followed these intense celebrations often lasted for weeks, leaving communities struggling to return to normal productivity while dealing with the after-effects of prolonged stress, inadequate sleep, and dietary extremes. People who had fasted for weeks before major holidays and then feasted excessively during celebrations found themselves dealing with serious digestive problems that were interpreted as divine punishment for improper spiritual preparation or excessive indulgence. The financial recovery from holiday celebrations could take months or even years, as families struggled to pay debts incurred for appropriate celebration, while still meeting their ongoing obligations to feudal lords, church authorities, and community needs. The pressure to celebrate magnificently often led to borrowing arrangements that created cycles of dependency and exploitation that lasted long after the celebrations themselves were forgotten. The emotional aftermath of these intense community performances was equally challenging. The artificial heightening of spiritual and social emotions during holidays, followed by the inevitable return to ordinary life, created patterns of depression and anxiety that medieval people had no framework for understanding or treating. The contrast between the transcendent moments of successful celebration and the grinding reality of daily survival was deliberately emphasized by church teaching as a reminder of the temporary nature of earthly joy. The seasonal cycle of these demanding celebrations meant that there was never truly a period of rest or recovery. As soon as one major holiday ended, preparations would begin for the next observance on the church calendar. The brief periods of ordinary time between celebrations were filled with anticipation and anxiety about upcoming spiritual tests, making it impossible for communities to ever fully relax or feel secure in their spiritual standing. The cumulative effect of living under this constant cycle of celebration and judgment was profound. Medieval people developed chronic anxiety about their spiritual performance, obsessive attention to religious details that might affect their eternal fate, and deep insecurity about their worthiness to participate in divine mysteries. The holidays that were supposed to bring joy and spiritual comfort instead became sources of ongoing stress and self-doubt. The children raised in this system of constant spiritual evaluation often grew into adults who were incapable of experiencing simple joy without guilt, who measured every pleasure against potential divine displeasure, and who lived in perpetual fear of not being good enough, faithful enough, or devoted enough to merit salvation. The psychological damage inflicted by this system of religious perfectionism affected generations of medieval people who never learned to trust in divine mercy or to find peace in their relationship with the sacred. The communities that survived these cycles of demanding celebration often developed collective trauma responses, becoming suspicious of outsiders who might judge their spiritual performance, defensive about their religious practices, and rigid in their adherence to traditional celebration methods that had proven acceptable in the past. Innovation or variation in holiday observance was seen as dangerous experimentation that might anger divine authorities or reveal spiritual inadequacy. Yet despite all this complexity, expense, and anxiety, medieval people continued to participate in these elaborate holiday celebrations year after year, generation after generation. They had no choice, of course, but many also found genuine moments of transcendence and community connection within the demanding framework of religious observance. The brief instances of perfect musical harmony during Christmas services, the profound silence of shared prayer during Easter vigils, the simple pleasure of abundant food after weeks of fasting. These moments of grace were precious enough to sustain people through the exhaustion and stress that surrounded them. The holidays also provided the only breaks in the monotonous routine of medieval survival, the only times when ordinary people could experience beauty, music, elaborate food, and community celebration. However demanding and fraught these observances might be, they offered glimpses of a world beyond daily drudgery, moments when the sacred intersected with the mundane in ways that transformed both the individual and the community. The stories that emerged from these celebrations, the memories that sustained families through difficult times, the traditions that connected people to their ancestors and their faith. These intangible gifts of holiday observance were perhaps worth the price paid in anxiety and exhaustion. Medieval people understood that their earthly celebrations were imperfect reflections of eternal joy, but they also believed that participating in these sacred mysteries, however imperfectly, brought them closer to divine truth. The legacy of these medieval holiday traditions can still be felt today in our modern celebrations, though stripped of their theological weight and community surveillance. The emphasis on perfect family gatherings, the stress of gift-giving obligations, the pressure to experience appropriate emotions during sacred seasons, these contemporary holiday challenges echo the medieval understanding that celebrations are performances that will be judged by others and that carry consequences beyond the moment of festivity. But we have gained something precious that medieval people never knew: the freedom to celebrate or not celebrate according to our own hearts, the ability to find spiritual meaning without community coercion, and the simple blessing of holidays that end when we choose, rather than when authorities declare them complete. Our celebrations may sometimes feel shallow compared to the intensity of medieval observance, but they also bring joy without the crushing weight of eternal judgment and community surveillance. As you drift towards sleep tonight, dear listener, let yourself feel grateful for this freedom. Let your breathing slow with the knowledge that your spiritual life belongs to you alone, that your celebrations can bring pure joy without performance anxiety, and that your relationship with the sacred unfolds according to your own rhythm, rather than the demanding drumbeat of community religious obligation. Close your eyes and imagine those weary medieval communities finally finding rest after their exhausting celebrations. their worries about spiritual adequacy dissolving into the gentle darkness of sleep. Rest peacefully in the knowledge that tomorrow will bring no mandatory observances, no community evaluations of your spiritual performance, and no consequences for choosing comfort over ceremony. The holidays of the past are finished now, their demands silenced by centuries of change. The only celebration that matters tonight is the quiet celebration of rest, the gentle holiday of sleep, and the simple blessing of living in a time when your joy belongs to you alone. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this journey through the demanding world of medieval celebrations, where every holiday was a test of faith, every feast a performance, and every moment of joy carried the weight of eternal significance. And so we come to the end of our journey through the exhausting world of medieval holidays, where every celebration was a community-wide performance that could determine your spiritual fate and social standing for years to come. We've walked through the smoky churches, where breath froze during midnight services, sat at feast tables where every bite carried theological weight, and watched communities strain under the relentless demands of a calendar that never offered true rest. What strikes me most about these medieval celebrations is how they transformed what should have been moments of joy into elaborate tests of faith and endurance. The Christmas morning that began before dawn with mandatory church attendance, the Easter preparations that could bankrupt a family, the endless cycle of saints' days that demanded perfect spiritual performance, all of this reveals a world where happiness itself was considered dangerous unless carefully regulated by religious authority. The psychological toll of living under such constant spiritual surveillance is almost impossible for us to imagine. Every smile had to be measured, every moment of pleasure weighed against the fear of divine displeasure, every celebration shadowed by the knowledge that your performance was being evaluated by neighbours who might report spiritual inadequacies to church authorities. The very concept of spontaneous joy was foreign in a world where even laughter required theological justification. Perhaps most tragically, these demanding observances often achieved the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of drawing people closer to the divine, the constant pressure for perfect spiritual performance created communities of anxious, exhausted individuals who lived in perpetual fear of not being good enough. The holidays that were meant to celebrate divine love became exercises in human inadequacy, reminders that mortal efforts could never satisfy the impossible standards of spiritual perfection. The children who grew up in this system learned early that joy was conditional, that celebration required permission, and that their worth was measured by their ability to perform appropriate religious emotions on command. They developed into adults who couldn't experience simple pleasure without guilt, who measured every moment of happiness against potential spiritual consequences, and who passed these anxieties on to their own children in an endless cycle of religious trauma. Yet, for all their complexity and cruelty, these medieval celebrations also reveal something profound about human resilience and the desperate need for meaning in difficult lives. People continued to participate in these exhausting observances, not just because they had no choice, but because the alternative, a world without sacred moments, without community gathering, without hope of transcendence, was even more unbearable than the demanding performances required by their faith. The brief moments of genuine connection that emerged from these celebrations, the perfect harmony of voices raised in Christmas song, the shared silence of Easter morning prayer, the simple warmth of community gathered around a feast table, were precious enough to sustain people through months of ordinary hardship. These glimpses of something greater than daily survival, however surrounded by anxiety and obligation, provided the spiritual nourishment that made medieval life bearable. The economic burden of these celebrations also reveals the profound importance they held in medieval society. Families would literally go hungry for months to afford appropriate holiday observances, spending resources they desperately needed on elaborate displays of faith that might last only a few days. This willingness to sacrifice basic necessities for spiritual celebration speaks to a worldview where earthly comfort was always secondary to eternal concerns, where the soul's needs took precedence over the body's survival. The community surveillance that surrounded these holidays, while oppressive by modern standards, also created bonds of shared experience that sustained medieval societies through times of crisis. Everyone who had suffered through the same demanding celebrations, who had faced the same spiritual tests and social pressures, shared an understanding that transcended individual differences. The collective exhaustion that followed major holidays was itself a form of community bonding, a shared recognition that they had all endured something difficult together. As we reflect on these ancient celebrations from the comfort of our modern world, it's easy to feel superior to our medieval ancestors, to congratulate ourselves on our freedom from such oppressive religious obligations. But perhaps we've also lost something valuable in our liberation from communal spiritual practice. Our modern holidays, for all their freedom and individual choice, often lack the depth and transcendent meaning that medieval people found even within their demanding observances. The question isn't whether we should return to medieval methods of celebration. The human cost was clearly too high, but whether we might learn something from their understanding that holidays are more than just breaks from work, that celebration without meaning becomes mere indulgence, and that some form of shared spiritual practice might enrich our individual lives in ways we've forgotten how to recognize. The medieval calendar, with all its demands and anxieties, was ultimately an attempt to create rhythm and meaning in lives that were often brutal and short. The constant cycle of preparation, celebration, and recovery gave shape to time that might otherwise have felt endless and purposeless. Even the exhaustion and stress of these observances served a function, creating shared experiences that bound communities together and provided frameworks for understanding suffering and joy. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your comfortable bed, free from the demands of mandatory celebration and community spiritual surveillance, take a moment to appreciate the gift of choice that defines our modern relationship with the sacred. Your holidays can bring pure joy without performance anxiety. Your celebrations can end when you choose, and your spiritual life unfolds according to your own heart's rhythm rather than the dictates of religious authority. But perhaps also carry with you some appreciation for those medieval communities who found ways to create transcendent moments within oppressive systems, who maintained hope for divine connection despite crushing spiritual demands, and who understood that some experiences are worth the price paid in exhaustion and anxiety. Their struggles to balance individual needs with communal obligations, spiritual aspirations with practical survival, echo in our own modern attempts to find meaning within freedom. The servants and working people who made these elaborate celebrations possible lived in a different kind of holiday hell altogether. While nobles and merchants worried about the spiritual implications of their feast performances, the laborers who actually created these magnificent displays faced physical demands that would break most modern people within days. Imagine being a kitchen servant during the Christmas season. You'd wake at 3 a.m. to begin stoking fires that had to burn at precise temperatures for roasting meats that weighed more than you did. Your hands would be permanently scarred from burns, your back bent from lifting massive cauldrons, your feet swollen from standing on stone floors for 18 hours at a stretch. There were no breaks, no shifts, no overtime pay. Just the endless, back-breaking work of turning raw ingredients into spiritual theatre for people who would judge the results as evidence of divine favour or displeasure. The laundresses faced their own nightmare. Holiday celebrations required spotless linens for church altars, pristine tablecloths for feast tables, and gleaming vestments for priests. But washing fabric in medieval times meant hauling buckets of water from wells or streams, heating them over fires, scrubbing everything by hand with lye soap that ate away at your skin, then hanging heavy, wet materials to dry in weather that rarely cooperated. A single stain on a Christmas altar cloth could be interpreted as spiritual contamination, making the laundress responsible not just for cleaning, but for maintaining the community's relationship with the divine. the craftsmen who built the stages for mystery plays, carved the decorations for churches, and created the elaborate props for religious pageants, worked with tools that were primitive and dangerous. A carpenter building a nativity scene worked by candlelight with axes and adzes that could easily slip and cause crippling injuries. A metalsmith forging decorative church ornaments worked over fires that filled his lungs with toxic smoke and subjected his eyes to damage from flying sparks. These weren't just jobs, they were forms of religious service that required physical sacrifice as proof of spiritual devotion. But perhaps most heartbreaking were the children pressed into service during holiday celebrations. Young boys served as altar servers during lengthy church services, standing motionless for hours while wearing heavy vestments in freezing churches, expected to perform complex liturgical duties without error, despite being barely old enough to understand what they were doing. Young girls were drafted as living angels for nativity scenes, required to remain perfectly still and serene while wearing uncomfortable costumes and surrounded by crowds of adults whose spiritual emotions could turn unpredictable. These child performers faced consequences that modern people would consider abuse. A boy who stumbled during a Christmas procession might be beaten by his parents for embarrassing the family before God. A girl who fidgeted during an Easter tableau could find herself subjected to extended fasting as punishment for insufficient reverence. The line between religious education and psychological trauma was virtually non-existent as children learned that their natural behaviors and needs were obstacles to spiritual perfection that had to be ruthlessly suppressed. The seasonal nature of medieval celebrations meant that communities lived in constant preparation for the next observance, never allowing for genuine rest or recovery. As soon as the Christmas season ended, Lent preparations began. After Easter exhaustion, summer saint days demanded attention. The autumn harvest festivals blended seamlessly into Advent preparations. It was an endless cycle that consumed every aspect of medieval life, leaving no space for personal reflection, individual spiritual development, or simple human enjoyment without religious significance. The toll on family relationships was severe. Marriages strained under the financial pressure of mandatory holiday expenses. Parents resented children whose needs interfered with spiritual obligations. Siblings competed for family resources that were always stretched thin by celebration requirements. Extended families fractured under the weight of differing interpretations of proper holiday observance. The very celebrations that were supposed to strengthen community bonds often destroyed the intimate relationships that formed their foundation. The elderly faced particular cruelty during holiday seasons. As their physical abilities declined, they struggled to meet the demanding requirements of lengthy services and complex rituals, but any sign of spiritual flagging was interpreted as moral weakness rather than natural aging. An old person who fell asleep during midnight mass wasn't seen as exhausted, but as spiritually indifferent. A grandmother who couldn't remember the words to newly required prayers faced accusations of insufficient devotion rather than sympathy for failing memory. Yet somehow, within this oppressive system of spiritual performance and community surveillance, medieval people still managed to find moments of authentic joy and genuine connection. A mother watching her child successfully complete their first solo hymn during Christmas service felt pride that transcended religious obligation. Friends sharing a meal after weeks of fasting experienced gratitude that was deeper than mere hunger relief. Communities that had worked together to mount successful celebrations developed bonds of shared accomplishment that sustained them through the darkest winter months. These glimpses of authentic human experience within an inhuman system remind us that people have always found ways to create meaning and connection, even under the most oppressive circumstances. The medieval holiday calendar, for all its demands and cruelties, couldn't entirely suppress the human capacity for joy, love, and transcendence. It could regulate these experiences, channel them into approved forms, and punish them when they exceeded acceptable bounds, but it couldn't eliminate them entirely. The legacy of these medieval celebrations echoes in our modern holiday anxieties, the pressure to create perfect family gatherings, the stress of meeting social expectations, the way celebration can become obligation. But we have freedoms our ancestors couldn't imagine. The right to skip celebrations that don't serve us, the ability to create our own traditions, the simple blessing of holidays that end when we want them to end. As your breathing slows and your eyes grow heavy, let yourself sink into the profound gratitude of living in a time when joy doesn't require permission, when celebration doesn't demand performance, and when your relationship with the sacred belongs to you alone. The candles in those cold medieval churches have long since guttered out, the mandatory processions have ended, and the exhausted celebrants have found their final rest. Sleep now in the gentle darkness of freedom, where tomorrow brings no spiritual examinations, no community judgments of your devotional adequacy, and no consequences for choosing peace over pageantry. The only holiday that matters tonight is the quiet celebration of rest, the gentle observance of sleep, and the simple blessing of waking in a world where your joy is your own to give and receive. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the demanding seasons of the past, where every celebration was a test and every moment of happiness carried the weight of eternity. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may your own celebrations always bring comfort rather than obligation, joy rather than judgment, and peace rather than the exhausting performance of faith.